Saigon from God. Biggest tragedy just happened in the USA. The whole world is shocked and scared.
After the tornado struck, anchors and reporters descended on Oklahoma, not just to assess the damage, but for the difficult task of talking.
The top-secret military operation happening overnight. This morning, President Donald Trump announcing the United
Look at that.
In a single stretch of time, America was shaken by events no one expected and few could explain. Rivers turned dark and lifeless. Animals fled in terror before any sirens sounded. Then, one storm after another slammed into the country, leaving little time to recover. Entire regions were left stunned, asking how so much could happen so fast. These were not isolated headlines. They unfolded together. Across states, across systems meant to protect us. Tonight, we're not here to panic, but to look closely, connect the dots, and ask what this moment is demanding from us. Coincidence or warning? If this makes you pause, share your thoughts in the comments. Like the video, subscribe, and stay with us as we go deeper. It began quietly, before sunrise, along stretches of the Mississippi River. What residents expected to be familiar, slow-moving water instead appeared darkened, stained with deep red and brown hues that did not reflect the morning light. Within hours, the riverbanks told a darker story. Thousands of fish surfaced lifeless, pressed together by a current that no longer sustained oxygen or movement. Birds circled overhead but refused to land. The smell of decay spread into neighborhoods that had relied on this river for generations. Authorities responded quickly. Environmental teams collected samples. Officials spoke carefully of algae blooms, agricultural runoff, or contamination still under investigation. Yet no overturned barges were found. No confirmed industrial spill was announced. Water intake facilities were shut down as a precaution. Fishing operations halted. Families stood silently at the river's edge, not shouting, not filming, just watching. Almost at the same time, something else unfolded inland. Across several states, sinkholes appeared overnight. Roads collapsed where there had been solid ground the evening before. Yards opened into the earth without warning. In some areas, homes were evacuated before daylight as the ground continued to give way. There were no earthquakes, no storms strong enough to explain the sudden failures. What unsettled people most was the timing, not weeks apart, but the same narrow window of hours, water failing, ground giving way, stability vanishing without notice. Scripture has long warned that moments like this would come not as entertainment, and not to provoke panic, but to awaken discernment. In Exodus 7:20, it is written, "All the water in the river was turned to blood, and the fish in the river died." And again, Isaiah 24:19 declares, "The earth is utterly broken. The earth is split apart. The earth is violently shaken." These words were recorded long before modern testing, yet they describe a pattern that feels uncomfortably familiar. What makes this moment different is the absence of chaos. There were no riots along the riverbanks, no mass hysteria near the sinkholes. Instead, there was stillness. Questions whispered instead of shouted. One resident asked a reporter, "If the water can die, what does that mean for us?" Science will continue its work, and it should. Explanations may come, data may eventually connect the dots, but history shows that when essential elements, water, ground, stability, begin to fail together, humanity is meant to pause, not to mock, not to dismiss, and not to panic. Because when what once gave life begins to take it away, the question is no longer, what just happened, but why now? As communities were still trying to process dying rivers and ground collapsing overnight, another signal emerged, quieter, faster, and in many ways more disturbing. This one did not come from instruments, satellites, or official statements. It came from animals. Across multiple states, livestock broke through fences in the middle of the night. Cattle that had followed the same routines for generations suddenly stampeded. Horses reared, kicked, and fled their stalls. Entire herds moved as if driven by something unseen, tearing through barriers built to hold them. Farmers who had lived through storms, floods, and tornadoes said the same thing. This was different. There was no thunder, no visible threat, just panic. At nearly the same time, birds abandoned entire regions simultaneously. Wetlands emptied. Fields went silent. Flocks rose together, darkening the sky for moments before vanishing toward unknown destinations. This was not seasonal migration. It was abrupt, coordinated, as if a switch had been flipped. Wildlife officials offered explanations: pressure changes, distant seismic activity, environmental stressors, but none could explain the timing or the scale. Even more unsettling was how wildlife moved as one. Deer surged across highways in waves, causing collisions and injuries. Dogs howled non-stop, clawing at doors as if trying to escape. In rural homes, families woke to animals refusing to rest, pacing until morning. These reactions were not random. They were unified. History and scripture records this pattern clearly. Creation reacts before people understand. Animals do not analyze headlines. They do not debate causes. They respond. In the Bible, animals entered the ark before the floodwaters fell, not because they understood judgment, but because warning was written into their nature. The prophet Hosea described a land mourning where even beasts and birds were affected. The Apostle Paul later wrote that creation groans, waiting for what is to come. This does not mean every unusual animal behavior is prophetic, but it does raise a serious question. What are they responding to when there is no obvious threat? In past disasters, animals have sensed danger before earthquakes, tsunamis, and volcanic eruptions. Science acknowledges this instinct, even if it cannot fully explain it. What made this moment different was the synchronization across regions, across state lines, within the same narrow window of time that rivers failed and ground collapsed. Farmers did not speak in panic. They spoke in disbelief. One said quietly, "They knew something we didn't." That sentence lingered. These events did not shout. They whispered. They did not accuse. They invited reflection. When animals refuse to rest, when creation moves first, humanity is often the last to ask why. The question is not whether this proves anything. The question is whether we are paying attention or waiting until understanding comes too late. Stay with us. What happens next may connect everything. In the days after the waters darkened and animals fled, a powerful storm system swept across the heart of the country. From California's interior valleys to the plains of Kansas, Missouri, and northern Oklahoma, forecasters initially described it with familiar language: severe thunderstorms, hail, strong winds, the kind of alerts Americans have learned to scroll past. But when the storm finally arrived, it brought something no warning had prepared people for. Hail fell in violent bursts, heavy enough to shatter windshields, rip through rooftops, and flatten crops within minutes. That alone was not unusual for parts of the Midwest. What stopped people in their tracks was the color. The ice was stained deep red. When it struck the ground and began to melt, water streamed through streets and farm fields, like something wounded, leaving crimson streaks across soil that had fed families for generations in Kansas and southern Missouri. Residents stood in silence. Some filmed. Others didn't move at all. In a rural area outside Wichita, one farmer knelt in his field, rubbing melting hail between his fingers, trying to understand what he was seeing. He later said he had lived through decades of storms, droughts, tornadoes, floods, and had never seen ice fall like that, never seen hail that seemed to bleed. Emergency crews documented widespread damage across multiple counties. Barns collapsed. Livestock were injured. Entire sections of winter wheat were destroyed in a single afternoon. Meteorologists from regional offices, including those monitoring storms moving east from California into the central states, moved quickly to explain what they could. Rare atmospheric conditions, mineral-rich dust drawn high into the storm, particles mixing with ice as it formed. These explanations were not unreasonable, and they were not dismissed. But even officials admitted the coloration was highly unusual. What made the moment linger was not just the science, but the symbolism people could not shake. Parents in Missouri struggled to answer their children when they asked why the rain was red. Neighborhoods in Oklahoma walked their streets after the storm had passed, looking down at water that did not look like water. No one screamed. No one ran. The reaction was quieter than fear. It was disturbance. In ancient texts, the sky is not merely weather, it is a messenger. Hail appears in Scripture not as a constant threat, but as interruption, as something that breaks routine and forces attention. In Exodus, hail fell during a time of hardened hearts. In Revelation, hail appears again, mingled with blood, not to satisfy curiosity, but to confront complacency. The prophet Joel spoke of signs in the heavens and on the earth, blood and fire before a decisive turning point. These passages were never meant to replace reason or override science. They were meant to sit alongside reality, asking whether moments like this are meant to be brushed aside as statistical anomalies or held up long enough to be examined. Because when the sky itself delivers something that feels out of place from California skies to Midwestern plains, damage is only part of what remains. Long after roofs are repaired and fields replanted, the image stays. Red ice, silent streets, soil stained in ways no one expected. Taken on its own, it could be called rare. Taken together with failing water, collapsing ground, fleeing animals, it becomes harder to dismiss as isolated, not proof, not verdict, but pattern, and patterns are what history has always warned us to watch. By the time the storms faded from memory, another phenomenon began to draw people's eyes upward. Across towns and rural stretches alike, reports surfaced of unexplained lights appearing in the night sky. Not aircraft, not fireworks, not anything easily named. They hovered, pulsed, shifted direction, then vanished, sometimes silently, sometimes with a low hum that left witnesses unsure of what they had just seen. In small communities, people stepped outside after sunset and simply stopped. Above rooftops and open fields, lights glowed where no stars should be. Some moved slowly in straight lines. Others flared suddenly, then dimmed as if swallowed by the darkness. Phones were raised, videos recorded, yet even those watching through screens struggled to describe what they were seeing. What unsettled many was not just the appearance of the lights, but their timing. They followed days marked by disruption on the ground, and unlike fleeting meteors, these lights lingered. Families stood together in driveways. Neighbors called one another outside. Conversations fell quiet as attention turned skyward. Authorities offered measured explanations. Satellites, atmospheric reflections, military testing, possibilities, not confirmations. But for many witnesses, those answers felt incomplete. The lights did not behave like known objects. They did not follow predictable paths, and they appeared across different regions within the same narrow window of time. Churches noticed something subtle but real. People began asking questions they hadn't asked in years. Not out of fear, but curiosity. Pastors spoke cautiously, reminding their congregations that Scripture has always described the heavens as communicative, not chaotic, but purposeful. Psalm 19 says, "The heavens declare the glory of God, the skies proclaim the work of His hands." And in Luke 21, Jesus warned of signs in the sun, moon, and stars that would leave nations perplexed. These verses were not offered as explanations, but as context. Online, footage of glowing orbs, streaking lights, and silent formations spread rapidly. Comment sections filled with debate. Some mocked, some speculated, others simply admitted uncertainty. Beneath the noise was a shared realization. Whatever these lights were, they disrupted the assumption that the sky was fully understood. What made this moment different was not spectacle but restraint. There was no mass panic, no official emergency, just people watching something they could not immediately categorize. A pause, a collective hesitation. History shows that when the sky captures human attention, it often precedes reflection rather than resolution. Lights do not shout answers, they invite questions, and perhaps that is their purpose. Because when attention is drawn upward away from routine, away from noise, the real issue is not what appears in the sky, but what stirs within those who are watching. If this moment makes you pause, if it raises questions you can't easily dismiss, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments below. While communities were still absorbing what had unfolded at home, the wider world offered no sense of relief. Beyond the rivers, fields, and neighborhoods of America, pressure was rising on a global scale, and it was rising fast. Tensions between major powers sharpened almost overnight. Military movements increased. Strategic language hardened. What had once been described as deterrence began to sound more like preparation. The United States found itself drawn deeper into overlapping confrontations, economic, political, and military, while rival powers tested limits with growing confidence. Lines that once held began to blur. In the Middle East, instability refused to settle. Ceasefires were announced, violated, renegotiated, and broken again. Each pause felt temporary, each agreement fragile. Behind every statement of peace lingered the knowledge that the next spark could ignite something far larger. The region remained a pressure point not just for local nations, but for the entire global system. Energy routes, military alliances, and ideological rivalries, all converging in the same narrow space. Elsewhere, rival powers moved in quieter but no less significant ways. Cyber operations intensified, economic leverage replaced open confrontation, sanctions met countermeasures, supply chains became weapons. What could not be seized by force was pressured through finance, technology, and influence. The battlefield expanded beyond borders, into markets, networks, and daily life. What made this moment especially volatile was timing. These tensions did not rise in isolation. They escalated alongside environmental disruption, economic strain, and social division. Systems that once absorbed shock now struggled under cumulative weight. Trust between nations thinned. Trust within nations fractured. History has shown that wars rarely begin with explosions. They begin with imbalance, when ambition outpaces restraint, when fear replaces patience, and when power is pursued faster than wisdom. The world appeared to be moving into such a phase, where restraint felt temporary and escalation felt inevitable. Ancient writings warned of this convergence, not simply wars, but rumors of wars. Not merely conflict, but uncertainty so widespread that nations grow restless and people feel unanchored. It is not the clash alone that defines these periods. It is the sense that peace itself has become fragile, negotiated moment by moment. Energy played its quiet role beneath the surface. Control of resources remained a silent driver behind public arguments. Oil, trade routes, and technological dominance shaped decisions long before they reached the headlines. Competition for stability paradoxically produced instability, as each move to secure advantage provoked response. For ordinary people watching from afar, the effect was subtle but real. Prices rose. Anxiety crept in. Conversations shifted from if something might happen to when. The sense of distance between global conflict and personal life began to shrink. Taken together, the signs formed a troubling alignment. A nation unsettled at home, a world unsettled abroad, pressure building without release. Not every era of tension leads to catastrophe, but every great turning point in history has shared this common trait. A moment when balance was lost, and the cost of restoring it became higher with every delay. And in such moments, the most dangerous assumption is that tomorrow will look exactly like yesterday. As pressure mounted from the ground, the sky, and the borders beyond, another shift became harder to ignore. Not dramatic, not sudden, but deeply structural. While disasters captured attention, systems were quietly tightening in the background. Governments moved to expand digital infrastructure under the language of efficiency, safety, and inclusion. Digital identification systems, centralized databases, and automated compliance tools were introduced as solutions to disorder. Each step was framed as temporary, reasonable, even necessary. Few questioned the long-term direction, because each change, on its own, seemed small. But history shows that control rarely announces itself all at once. It advances in increments, especially during moments of instability. When people feel unsafe economically, environmentally, geopolitically, they are more willing to trade autonomy for reassurance. Security becomes the currency, convenience becomes the justification. At the same time, economic pressure intensified. Inflation strained households, debt climbed, energy costs rippled through every layer of life, from transportation to food production. Markets became volatile, reacting not only to numbers, but to fear. The gap between those insulated from crisis and those exposed to it widened quietly but relentlessly. Energy remained at the center of it all. Oil, supply chains, and strategic resources dictated alliances and rivalries alike. Nations spoke of climate goals while competing fiercely for fuel. Dependency deepened, even as alternatives lagged behind demand. The result was a system stretched thin, too interconnected to fail easily, yet too fragile to absorb sustained shock. Alongside economic strain came cultural pressure. Education, speech, belief, and values increasingly fell under regulatory scrutiny. What had once been debated openly was now managed through policy, platforms, and enforcement. Uniformity was encouraged not through force, but through access. Who could participate, who could transact, who could function without restriction. These developments did not occur in isolation. They mirrored patterns described long ago, a convergence of control, commerce, and authority forming during periods of uncertainty. Not chaos, but coordination. Not collapse, but consolidation. What made this moment unsettling was how seamlessly it aligned with everything else. Environmental disruption created urgency. Global conflict justified surveillance. Economic instability demanded restructuring. Each crisis reinforced the next, creating momentum towards centralized solutions. None of this required malicious intent to be effective. Systems built for order often grow strongest when fear does the work for them, and once established, they rarely retreat on their own. The deeper question was not whether these systems were efficient, they often were. The question was whether efficiency had begun to replace wisdom, whether resilience was being traded for control, whether humanity, in its effort to stabilize the world, was building structures too rigid to bend when something truly unexpected arrived. Ancient warnings spoke not only of visible upheaval, but of subtle alignment when power, economy, and authority moved together toward a single framework. Not overnight, gradually, almost imperceptibly. In such times, the danger is not only what is enforced, but what is surrendered willingly. Because once systems decide who may buy, who may sell, who may participate, and who may resist, the shape of the future is no longer formed by events alone, but by the structures built to respond to them. And structures, once set in motion, have a way of outlasting the crises that created them. When all of these moments are placed side by side, the question becomes impossible to avoid, not because the answer is clear, but because the pattern is. Water failed where it once sustained life. Ground collapsed without warning. Animals fled before danger could be named. The sky delivered something that felt out of place. Pressure rose within nations and between them. Systems tightened quietly as instability spread. None of these events alone demand a conclusion. Together, they demand attention. History teaches that great turning points rarely announce themselves with certainty. They arrive layered, compressed, and confusing. People living through them often do not recognize their significance until much later. What they feel first is not understanding, but unease, a sense that the familiar rules are shifting. Scripture never describes signs as entertainment or spectacle. They are described as signals meant to awaken discernment. Jesus spoke of a time when nations would be perplexed, when the sea and waves would roar, when hearts would fail from fear of what was coming upon the world. Yet he did not instruct people to panic. He instructed them to watch. Watching does not mean guessing dates or forcing conclusions. It means refusing to drift back into distraction when something demands reflection. It means asking whether our foundations, personal, moral, spiritual, are strong enough to endure instability. It means recognizing that control, technology, and power can never substitute for wisdom. Some will insist these events are only natural cycles, political tensions, or statistical anomalies. Others will rush to declare judgment, but between denial and hysteria lies a quieter response: humility. The willingness to admit that humanity does not control as much as it believes. The willingness to consider that warnings are sometimes merciful, designed not to condemn, but to correct course. Throughout history, moments of upheaval have often preceded renewal, not because destruction is good, but because complacency is dangerous. When life moves too smoothly for too long, people stop asking essential questions. Crisis reintroduces them. This moment may pass. Explanations may come. Systems may stabilize. Or this may be the early movement of something far larger still unfolding. The truth is, no one can say with certainty, but every generation is judged not by what it predicted, but by how it responded when the ground beneath it began to shift. The most important question, then, is not whether these events prove a sign from God. The question is whether we are willing to examine ourselves as if they might be, whether we choose awareness over apathy, reflection over distraction, wisdom over comfort. Because when the world sends signals through nature, through conflict, through pressure, The real test is not how loudly they speak, but whether anyone is listening. If this video made you think, leave a comment below.